If a single word could ignite a civilization, it would be the first word revealed. Read. Read, even if your candle is small and the night is long. Read, even if all you own is hunger and hope. From which country are you watching this video? Subscribe to this channel if you love Islam. That one command turned curiosity into worship and turned learning into a kind of prayer that never ends. In its echo, cities woke up before dawn, not only to call people to Salah, but to call minds to questions. Homes became circles of study, courtyards turned into classrooms, and the marketplace hummed with reciters, scribes, and bookbinders who treated ink like treasure. Endowments Waqf quietly paid for lamps in libraries, so no student had to choose between darkness and a dream. Hospitals healed bodies in the day and taught medicine at night. Caravans carried spices and paper, ideas and instruments, bringing India's numbers, Persia's philosophy, Greece's logic, and new insights born under minarets. In Baghdad's houses of wisdom and in Cordoba's luminous streets, catalogues listed thousands of titles, and it wasn't strange to see a jurist discussing geometry or a poet debating astronomy, because knowledge wasn't a narrow alley, it was a wide road to God. Prayer times required precision, so astronomers charted the sky with devotion that felt like Dicker of the stars. Finding the Qibla demanded geography, so maps became more honest and directions more merciful. Contracts needed fairness, so arithmetic became a language of justice that merchants and judges could both speak. Teachers traveled from city to city with satchels of notes, granting ijazas not as medals of pride, but as permissions to serve. Mothers endowed schools, daughters taught hadith, and sons copied books until fingertips were black with ink, because a family that loves Allah also loves knowledge. Paper mills beat plant fibers into sheets that could outlive empires, and bookbinders wrapped wisdom in leather so it would survive rain, trade, and time. In those pages, scholars argued respectfully when to accept a report, how to weigh evidence, what to do when a theory shines, but the observation says otherwise, because truth was the guest of honor and humility was the doorman. Even beauty bowed into service. Calligraphers shaped letters that made reading an act of serenity. Architects set courtyards around fountains so the mind could cool, and poets wrote verses that carried the rhythm of revelation into the river of reason. And through it all, the heartbeat stayed the same. Bismillah before the experiment, Alhamdulillah after the result, and a soft Astaghfirullah when the numbers didn't add up, because failure was never final, it was just another invitation to read again. Imagine the soft hiss of a lamp, the scratch of a reed pen, and a scholar whispering to a student, knowledge is a trust. That trust crossed deserts and oceans, sat in the laps of artisans and rulers, and taught a world that you can be faithful and rigorous, devout and daring, all at once. This is how a word became a world. This is how a command became a culture that tucked children into bed with stories of stars and woke adults with duties to measure, to map, and to make life more just. And as you listen now, your listening itself is part of that river, because every ear that leans toward truth widens the stream a little more. So read with your ears, reflect with your heart, and carry forward the lantern that once turned night into a classroom. Numbers look simple on a page, but they were once a maze that only patience could solve, and Muslim civilization brought lanterns to that maze. From the markets of Basra and the docks of Siraf, to the courts of Bukhara and the workshops of Fez, calculation had to be fast, fair, and teachable. The arrival of place value numerals and the quiet power of zero made arithmetic move like water instead of stone. No more piling pebbles or wrestling with clumsy symbols. Merchants could track inventories across seasons. Astronomers could compute angles without drowning in ink. And students could learn methods that worked every time, not just sometimes. Then came algebra, not as a parlor trick, but as a compass for real life, dividing inheritances with justice, measuring fields after floods, calculating dowries and debts, and setting the proportions of domes that still hold up the sky. Equations were balanced the way a judge balances a case. Bring like terms together, cancel the noise, reveal the truth. Quadratic problems were no longer riddles whispered in bazaars, but procedures you could teach, test, and trust. From algebra's written steps grew the idea of the algorithm, a promise that any complex task can be broken into clean, finite moves, like a prayer sequence for the intellect. Decimals emerged to whisper precision into trade and astronomy. Fractions stopped being clumsy guesses and became instruments of fine detail. Tables recorded squares, cubes, and roots, so builders could size beams, surveyors could lay boundaries, and navigators could bring ships home by logic instead of luck. Proportions tuned fountains to sing at the right pressure. Recipes for inks and glass found their ratios, and architects sketched courtyards whose shade landed exactly where people needed rest. Students practiced on inheritance puzzles because the Quran made fairness non-negotiable, and math rose to meet that moral standard. A scribe could calculate how many sheets a commission required, a caravan master could price goods across currencies, and an apprentice could learn to check every step, because mathematics had become a language of honesty. Even poetry slipped numbers into its rhythm, proof that precision and beauty can share the same breath. And if algebra once felt like a storm of symbols, teachers gentled it into stories. A garden split among heirs, a wall raised by measured bricks, a journey plotted along known distances, each problem a parable of balance and mercy. The more minds learned this craft, the more the world itself felt solvable, not because it grew simpler, but because hearts grew steadier. Behind every calculation stood intention: to trade without cheating, to build without waste, to schedule prayer with care, to navigate by stars and come home alive. By the time these methods crossed seas into other languages, they carried more than symbols. They carried a way of thinking that treats confusion as a temporary guest and clarity as a duty. And that is the real miracle of numbers in this story. Not just that sums add up, but that souls stand up straighter when they learn how to weigh, to measure, and to be fair. In that fairness, algebra stops being a school subject and becomes a form of worship, a quiet testimony that order exists, that balance is possible, and that truth, like a well-solved equation, will always reveal itself when you approach it with patience and light. Night after night, 1,000 rooftops became observatories, and the sky wasn't just something to admire, it was a text to read. People listened for the whisper of dawn not only with their ears, but with instruments tuned to the quiet mathematics of the heavens. An astrolabe hung from a scholar's belt like a pocket-sized universe, its plates engraved with star maps and latitude lines, its ret spinning to match constellations that have guided hearts for millennia. With a glance and a practiced hand, it gave prayer times, the length of the day, the altitude of the sun, and the direction of the Qibla from almost anywhere upon the earth. Travelers carried it across deserts where dunes shifted like waves. Sailors used it on restless decks, taking sights through salt rough air to learn where they were when there were no landmarks but God's lanterns. In workshops lit by oil lamps, artisans cut brass with the patience of gardeners planting orchards, knowing that 1/10 of a degree etched crooked could mislead an entire caravan. Tables called Zij gathered the lifework of generations. Star positions, eclipses, planetary motions, corrections upon corrections, as careful eyes noticed that a figure felt just a little off, and had the courage to test it against the night again. Accuracy became a kind of devotion. Giant quadrants were anchored into observatory walls so they could not shiver in the wind. Mural sextants turned stone into instruments. Armillary spheres traced the celestial circles with rings that glittered like captured orbits. From Samarkand to Maraga, from Ray to Cordoba, observatories rose where scholars looked beyond the sparkle to the pattern underneath, asking not only where the stars are, but how precisely we can know. Trigonometry matured from a few neat tricks into a language of angles and arcs, with sine, cosine, and tangent tables copied and copied until they were as common in a student's bag as ink and string. Spherical trigonometry, once a specialized curiosity, became daily bread for navigators and jurists, determining sacred directions on a round world where straight lines on parchment bend with the mercy of the globe. Prayer is due at a time, and a time is bound to the sun, and the sun obeys laws that can be measured. So piety learned to keep time with mathematics as its metronome. The length of the solar year was tightened by observation. The inclination of the earth measured more carefully, and calendars tuned so that fasting began under the correct moon, and festivals met the faithful on schedule. Some nights, the horizon revealed its own lessons. The way twilight lingers, though the sun is already gone. The way the color of dawn rises before the light itself. The way the atmosphere stretches and bends rays, so that what is seen is not always where it appears to be. Caravans timed departures by the temper of the stars. Ships learned the patience of latitude, measuring the height of Polaris as a promise that north would remain true even when clouds hid the coast. Inland, surveyors fixed boundaries by triangulating across fields and rooftops. Architects borrowed heaven's circles and fit them into domes that caught sound like a blessing. Poets borrowed star names for metaphors, and scientists borrowed them for indices. The very idea of error changed no longer a sin of carelessness, but a number you could estimate, reduce, and account for. So observations came with margins, instruments came with instructions, and data came with the humility to say, this is what we saw with these tools at this time. To find the Qibla from far coasts, scholars drew geometric proofs as elegant as mosaics, turning a sphere into manageable triangles, then into direction and distance someone could actually use to lay foundations and face their prayer rug without doubt. Monsoon winds were described as rhythms instead of mysteries, useful for merchants steering toward pepper coasts and for students imagining an earth where winds and water have seasons of their own. The night sky itself became a cathedral of reason where no star was too small to deserve a name and no chart too large to deserve revision. And in that habit of careful sight, a culture learned to trust both the eye and the equation, to welcome beauty and proof as sisters, and to let wonder grow up into knowledge without losing its childlike joy. Imagine a winter night so clear you can count the faint stars at the edge of your vision. Now imagine copying their positions onto brass, error by error made smaller every generation until the instrument in your hand becomes a promise. We can know where we are. We can say when to pray. We can draw the map of heaven's lamps and still remember that each lamp is a sign. Thus, the sky stopped being distant and became near, a companion for travelers and a teacher for mathematicians, a canvas of divine order that invited human order in response. Every solved angle softened a journey, every corrected table protected a ship, every named star gave a child a point to wonder at and a scholar a point to measure from, and between the two, between wonder and measurement, the world learned to walk more safely beneath the mercy of the night. If the heavens taught how to find our way, light taught how to see what was true. For centuries, people guessed at vision like poets guessing at wind, until a stubborn mind insisted that guessing is not enough. Darken a room, pierce a small hole, and the outside world appears upside down upon the opposite wall. The camera obscura, not as a toy but as a test that exposes truth with the simplest materials. With that small experiment, light revealed that it travels in straight lines, that images are formed when rays enter the eye, not when the eye sends something out, and that the path of brightness can be traced, measured, and predicted. From that moment, optics stepped out of story and into law. Mirrors were no longer magic but geometry. Angles of incidence greeted angles of reflection like twins, and refractions bending at a boundary from air to water or glass acquired rules that could be written and checked. A drop of oil on water, a rod half submerged in a courtyard basin, the shimmer above a desert road, each became a page in a textbook still being written by sunlight itself. Lenses, once mere curiosities, turned into instruments with purpose, to magnify what is too small for comfort, to bring close what distance makes vague, to condense rays upon a point of fire or spread them softly for sight. Craftsmen learned to grind and polish with a patience rivaling the scribes, because a tiny ripple on a lens could turn clarity into confusion. And scholars learned to test one another's claims with repeatable steps, because a single demonstration outweighs 1,000 confident assertions. Optical books filled with diagrams asked the reader to observe the way shadows lean, the way light leaks around an edge to soften it, the way pinholes sharpen an image by rejecting most rays and admitting only those obedient to straight lines. The rainbow lost none of its beauty when it found explanation. The halo around the moon turned from omen into optical delight. Twilights linger, found reason in scattering and the thickness of the air. And the glow of the sky when the sun is just below the horizon became a lesson in how the world wears a luminous veil even after the lamp has dipped. Reading turned into an optical act, too, script styles optimized for legibility, inks adjusted for contrast, page sizes chosen to sit in the sweet space where eyes tire least. Architects learned to invite light in ways that honored both function and feeling, slanting windows to catch mornings, carving screens that admit day while guarding privacy, and placing pools that make courtyards double bright with reflections. Doctors of the eye took notes that still feel modern, distinguishing diseases by symptoms and response to light, recommending treatments that respect both structure and the soul's reliance on sight. But the most important inheritance was not a list of facts but a way of working. Begin with a question small enough to test, build a device simple enough to trust, note what happens slowly enough to be honest, and then invite others to repeat it so truth becomes a public good. In that method, errors are not shameful. They are guides that lead the researcher back to the bench with better plans. Optics became the teacher of intellectual manners. If a claim feels elegant but fails the pinhole, retire the elegance. If a conclusion is beloved but the beam will not bend as predicted, let go of the conclusion and keep the love for reality. Light, which begins every day without asking permission, became the standard of sincerity in study. Workshops that once perfumed the air with rosewater for glass, polishing now perfumed minds with the discipline of experiment, and libraries that once prized narratives turned an equal pride toward diagrams, where little arrows showed the travel of rays like pilgrims on a straight path. Glasses improved reading at age and restored work to hands that would otherwise have retired. Focusing lenses transformed small heat into useful fire, and the understanding of reflection made instruments that could peer into tight spaces or signal across distances without words. Even in worship, light's lessons were welcomed. The way dawn enters a prayer hall at a precise angle on a precise date, the way shadow marks can serve as sundials, the way a niche can echo not only sound but brightness toward the congregation. Rainbows no longer competed with revelation. They joined it as signs in the sky that reward attention with both awe and explanation. Children learned with delight that turning a room into a camera is as easy as a cloth, a wall, and a hole. Artisans learned that certain shapes gather brightness without glare. Scholars learned that humility toward observation is not a secular posture, but a spiritual one, because truth is a trust. In time, the spirit of optics leapt from dark rooms into every craft. Surveyors checked sightlines before they cut. Engineers tested the shimmer of heat around machines. Book designers placed margins for comfort. Physicians peered with lenses and wrote with the caution of those who know that the eye can deceive. The result was a civilization in which both the poet and the physicist could stand at the same window and agree on what they saw. Then take that agreement in different directions, one toward metaphor, the other toward measurement, without parting company as seekers of the same truth. That is the gift of light rightly understood. It does not flatter us, it does not argue, it simply goes where it must, straight and faithful, making the world visible, and in its company, the intellect learns to do the same. So when a page gleams under a lamp, or a courtyard brightens under noon, remember the generations who learned to question light with reverence, to shape it with glass, to root it with mirrors, to measure it with instruments, and to let its honesty reform their thinking. In that glow, faith and method are not rivals but reflections, and every clear image, whether of a face, a line of script, or a star, becomes a quiet proof that seeing can be a path to gratitude. The door to care was never locked. Walk in from a hot street, and you would hear water running in courtyard channels, smell the clean bite of vinegar and herbs, and see order where panic might have lived. Hospitals by Maristan stood open not just for the wealthy or the connected, but for anyone who arrived with pain, fever, broken bone, dimmed sight, or a mind weighed down with grief. Endowments quietly paid for this mercy so a stranger could receive a bed, a meal, a physician's time, and a pharmacist's skill without coins changing hands. Inside, need met knowledge in ways that still feel modern. Wards were separated by illness to protect the healthy and calm the fearful, with airy rooms for fevers, quiet spaces for the exhausted, and shaded gardens where the recovering could listen to fountains and remember how to breathe without pain. Physicians didn't simply collect theories, they collected patients, notes, and patterns. Rounds brought teacher and students to the bedside, so learning happened in whispers and pulse counts instead of abstractions, and case histories recorded symptoms, treatments, and outcomes with a seriousness that honored the person behind the problem. Apothecaries, guarded by shelves of labeled jars, measured powders and syrups on balances as carefully as judges weigh testimony, compounding remedies that had to match a standard so one healer's promise did not contradict another's. Licensing existed not to keep secrets but to keep standards, because skill without accountability is just a risk in a white coat. Surgeons washed instruments and kept them ready, a small orchestra of scalpels, forceps, hooks, and needles, their steel tempered by craft and their use guided by restraint. The soporific sponge, soaked in aromatics, offered courage to the fearful and rest to the suffering during difficult procedures, and when the work was done, the patient received not only medicine but food tailored to recovery, a recognition that the body heals with materials and with mercy. Ophthalmology flourished where desert light can be hard on eyes. Physicians described the architecture of sight with care, distinguished similar conditions by how they reacted to brightness, and treated the organ that carries so much of our daily world with a reverence equal to its fragility. Dentistry was not an afterthought. Teeth were cleaned, extracted, and set right with tools designed for mouths, not improvised from elsewhere. Midwives and women scholars shared knowledge, woman to woman, ensuring childbirth and newborn care were not left to rumor, but to trained hands and tested practices. Mental health was not mocked. Quiet courtyards offered music, fragrance, and human dignity to minds carrying invisible storms, a sign that compassion recognizes wounds the eye cannot see. Public health stepped beyond the hospital gates with rules for markets, slaughterhouses, and water channels so that prevention could do part of the work that cure cannot. Quarantine in times of outbreak, cleanliness in times of routine, and record-keeping at all times turned a city into a partner for wellness instead of a hazard to it. Medical encyclopedias arranged knowledge, like a well-run pharmacy arranges shelves, anatomy next to function, diagnosis next to differential, treatment next to warnings, so the reader could move from question to action without losing their way. Dietaries offered guidance for seasons and temperaments, acknowledging that food can be a quiet medicine or a subtle harm depending on how it is given. Ethics texts spoke directly to the healer's heart, reminding the physician that every patient has a name, a family, a fear, a prayer, and that the point of learning is service, not status. You could see the difference in the small things. Hospitals lending clothing to the poor so they could leave with dignity. Libraries open to staff so their minds stayed as sharp as their hands. Gardens planted not only for beauty, but for pharmacopoeia. Wherever the need for accurate timekeeping touched patient care, timed doses, scheduled poultices, measured intervals for fever, watching astronomy's discipline of hours and angles slipped into the ward without ceremony, showing how sciences become a single family when they serve human well-being. In lecture rooms, teachers confessed limits as readily as they shared knowledge, modeling an honesty that students would carry to bedsides. Errors were studied, not hidden, because a mistake that educates the next generation becomes an offering to those who will never suffer it again. Even architecture joined the healing team. High windows for ventilation without drafts, stone basins for frequent washing, courtyards for light that lifts mood and warms bones, and prayer spaces close by to remind staff and patient alike that the life of the body and the life of the soul converse constantly. Outside the cities, caravanserais hosted traveling clinics because a civilization convinced that knowledge is a trust tries to carry it where the road carries people. Herbalists walked irrigation lines, noting which plants thrive in which soils, then returned with leaves, barks, and seeds to test and blend with patient caution. Dissections were described with care when appropriate and with humility always, because to know the body's layout is to better avoid harm inside it. And at day's end, the ledger of service was tallied not only in cures, but in kindnesses offered, questions answered, and fears calmed, because healing begins the first moment a person feels seen. From these habits rounds, records, formularies, licensing, sanitation, triage, dietetics, grew an ethos that traveled across languages and centuries. It taught that medicine is the art of attention. Listen to the pulse as if it speaks, observe the fever as if it teaches, match the remedy to the person instead of the other way around, and remember that a prayer whispered at a bedside is not separate from the thermometer or the spoon. When this spirit crossed seas and entered other schools, it carried with it an image of care that remains stubbornly contemporary. Hospitals as places of learning, pharmacies as laboratories of precision, physicians as servants of both craft and conscience. And if you could hold for a moment the thousand small mercies of such a day, a bowl of broth warmed for a shivering patient, a lens fitted to a reader's eyes, a splint wrapped just right, a ledger corrected to reflect the truth, you would understand why entire cities felt richer, not when their treasuries swelled, but when their hospitals did their quiet work and the sick left, lighter than they arrived. In rooms that smelled of cedar chests, warm glass, and rosewater, another transformation took place, one that taught fire to behave and vapors to confess their secrets. Here, the discipline once called alchemy grew into a careful chemistry of apparatus and notes, of experiments designed to be repeated by someone other than their author. Alembics arched like domes over boiling flasks, retorts curved like question marks toward the truth, coiled condensers turned invisible breath into dripping clarity, and filters sat like patient judges, letting only the right grains pass. Balances, polished and merciless, kept pride from creeping into the recipe, because the scale does not care about your theory. With these tools, artisans and scholars learned to coax essences from blossoms until perfumes could hold spring in a small vial. And they learned to refine oils until lamps burned with steadier light that did not smoke a reader's page into gloom. Acids and alkalis were characterized not as spirits and tempers, but as reagents with behavior you could predict, naming their strengths and taming their uses so that leather could be tanned without ruin, metals cleaned without loss, and medicines prepared with consistency. Crystallization became a story in slow motion. Dissolve, cool, seed, grow, teaching patience and precision to hands that had to leave the beaker alone at the right moment or crystallize chaos instead of order. Sublimation carried solids into vapor and back again, as if to say that matter has pathways we can follow and loops we can close if we respect its temperaments. Dyes learned to cling to cloth with the help of mordants, and color rose from plant and mineral into garments that could carry a city's mood through a season without fading. Ink makers balanced carbon and gum until script flowed like water but dried like truth, a black that would not feather across paper, fibers, or surrender to the touch of worried fingers. Paper makers sized their sheets so a reed pen could skate without bleeding, and binders learned glues that would not crack in dry air or mildew in humid nights. Glass workers, with furnaces like tame volcanoes, learned the tricks of clarity and tint, blowing vessels thin enough to seem impossible and grinding lenses thick enough to be useful, so that an apothecary could see to his measurements and a scholar could see to her lines of script late into the evening. Ceramicists fired glazes that flashed with metallic luster, a skin of light that turned a simple bowl into a captured dawn, and they studied the balance of silica, flux, and pigment until beauty could survive both heat and handling. Metalworkers folded and tempered, learning that not all steel is the same and that the recipe for strength is a conversation between ore, carbon, temperature, and time. Soap makers took oils and ashes, transformed them through reaction into bars that lifted dirt and disease from skin and cloth. And in doing so, they improved households and hospitals alike with a cleanliness that makes every other remedy more effective. Perfumers and physicians collaborated when a scent calmed a patient or masked a bitterness, revealing that chemistry also speaks to mood, not just matter. Distillers captured alcohol not to escape the world, but to sterilize tools, extract flavors, preserve tinctures, and teach that volatility can be harnessed for precision. Every bench became a school of method. Label the jar with date and batch. Record the flame's color, not just its size. Note the point at which vapors begin and end, the wait before and after, the color shift at half an hour, the smell when the lid first lifts. Then, invite a colleague to repeat it, because truth that cannot be repeated is not yet truth. It is only a story waiting for its test. This habit of writing procedures with enough clarity that an apprentice could succeed became the quiet engine of progress, turning workshops into networks and generations into collaborators. Out of such patience came practical miracles. Textiles that did not run in the wash, leather that did not crack in the sun, inks that did not vanish from the archive, and medicines that did not vary wildly from one apothecary to the next. Cities smelled different, too less of refuse and more of soaps and aromatics, because chemistry entered kitchens and laundries with the same seriousness it brought to laboratories. Wherever water flowed, knowledge followed it, tracing how to soften hard wells, how to clarify murky cisterns, how to keep channels from fouling with growths that steal flow and spread sickness. Miners learned to wash, crush, and separate with less waste, to smelt with cleaner burns, and to tell one ore from another with tests more certain than rumor. Pigments for illuminators, vermilion, verdigris, and beyond were prepared with recipes that balanced brilliance with stability, so a manuscript's colors could glow across centuries instead of browning into mud. Even cuisine met chemistry with joy. Sugar was clarified and pulled into textures that delighted courts and markets alike. Rosewater and orange blossom added to sweets with an exactness that knew how much is perfume and how much is overpowering, and preserves learned the discipline of pH long before anyone wrote those letters. Meanwhile, the philosophical promise that once haunted alchemy, the dream of changing base into noble, was transformed into a more faithful wonder, changed low into useful, raw into refined, dangerous into safe, scattered into pure. That is a better miracle because it serves more people. Ethics stood beside the furnace like a supervisor, asking whether a process wastes water that neighbors need, whether a dye poisons the hands that use it, whether a perfume business treats harvesters fairly, whether the profit from a discovery finds its way to endowments that build schools and hospitals. Books of secrets stopped being hoards and became manuals, because a craft that hides dies with its master, but a craft that shares becomes a river. And when these books traveled translated in ports and border towns, they carried more than recipes. They carried a way of seeing that insists matter has manners if we take time to learn them. In the end, the laboratory taught the same lesson as the prayer rug and the clinic. Begin with cleanliness, proceed with intention, measure your steps, accept correction, and give thanks for results, whether they thrill or disappoint, because both move you closer to what is. Stand in such a workshop and you will notice how quiet it is, not from lack of work, but from the concentration of people listening to reactions as if they speak. A bead of distillate gathers, falls, and the scribe notes the minute. A flame shifts from yellow to blue, and a student adjusts the draft. A crystallizing dish receives a seed, and then a garden of angles rises from a liquid plane. Every motion is deliberate, because every outcome will be read by someone not present today. This is how knowledge outlives its authors. This is how a civilization turns curiosity into reliable gifts, glass that clarifies, dyes that endure, metals that strengthen, soaps that cleanse, inks that testify, perfumes that console, and medicines that heal. And when night falls and the furnaces cool, the ledger of the day shows a different kind of wealth. Improved methods, fewer accidents, better yields, cleaner rivers, safer tools, and apprentices who can now carry the method forward. From the hush of those rooms came a language of steps and weights that would one day be spoken everywhere, a grammar of matter that respects the Creator by respecting creation, and a promise that careful hands guided by grateful hearts can refine not only substances, but societies. Water was the first machine, and engineers learned to speak its language until streams and springs behaved like partners rather than strangers. In dry lands where survival depends on precision, they stitched mountains to valleys with underground channels that moved cool water by the gentlest of slopes, protected from sun and contamination, arriving in towns as if the earth itself had decided to be generous. Open your ears and you'd hear the soft logic of a noria turning, clay jugs lifting and pouring in a rhythm older than any clock, powered by the patient push of a river. Elsewhere, a sweep arm and bucket wheel drawn by a quiet animal or by wind itself raised water from wells all day without complaint, irrigating orchards whose shade taught cities to breathe. Canals braided through fields with sluice gates that answered to the farmer's hand, proving that a finger's breadth of flow can make the difference between dust and bread. Where the terrain tried to argue, bridges argued back with mathematics, their arches calculated, their piers streamlined to shrug away flood force, their spans set by ledger rather than guess. In workshops that smelled of sawdust and oil, makers carved teeth into wooden wheels, mated gears at right angles, and sent rotary motion down shafts to grind flour, press olives, full cloth, hammer metal, and cut timber with a smoothness that felt like mercy to tired arms. The crankshaft made circles translate into push and pull sing back into circles, a reciprocity that turned water and wind into labor that never needed sleep. Vertical axis windmills rose where gusts swirl instead of marching in a single line, their sails catching opportunity from any direction, turning mills that fed families and kept bakers honest to their morning promises. Public fountains weren't decor, they were engineering statements about pressure and gradient, delivering sips to the thirsty and cleanliness to a people who understood that hygiene is not luxury, but law. In palaces and caravanserais, water clocks counted hours with bowls, floats, valves, and allegories, beautiful facades that hid careful hydraulics. Behind the lion that roared or the bird that sang was an escapement of droplets, nudging time forward at a measured pace. Automata delighted children and dignitaries, but their true gift was pedagogical. These playful marvels smuggled principles into memory siphons that prime themselves, feedback that stabilizes flow, cams that turn smooth rotation into choreographed gestures. Manuals recorded all this without jealousy, drawing cross-sections, labeling parts, listing maintenance intervals, and warning where wood swells or where bronze must be polished, because a genius that cannot be taught is not yet wisdom. Cities learned to move with machines as allies. Mills at river bends kept markets supplied, pumps kept cisterns sweet, covered channels protected the vulnerable from contamination, and simple overflow stones along street gutters told a passerby at a glance whether the system was healthy. When floods came, gates were lifted in sequences planned months earlier. When drought arrived, ration charts and night flow schedules married fairness to physics. At the scale of the household, pitchers with clever necks poured without splashing, ewers delivered exactly a hand's washing, sieves removed grit before it reached the kitchen's tongue, and stoves were vented so air and fire danced cleanly. At the scale of empire, caravan routes chose wells and qanat mouths as beats in a song, staging posts placed by calculation so no beast or bearer fell between notes. The moral dimension of machinery never wandered far. A broken gate is not an inconvenience, but a risk to the poor. An unmaintained mill raises bread prices before anyone notices the reason. A pump that leaks is a theft from neighbors downstream. So inspectors walked the lines, not as tyrants, but as stewards, and endowments paid craftsmen to keep public works at public standards. Engineers became authors of peace and quiet grain, measured by regular wheels rather than frantic hands, cloth finished by steady beaters, oil pressed by persistent screws, medicine ground to uniform fineness, each process reliable, repeatable, accountable. Even play had principles. Gardens with hidden channels made rills that whispered, basins that refilled from below without visible source, and jets that rose just high enough to cool the air without stealing water from crops. When people from other lands came to study, They wrote home about the feeling of a city tuned to water, courtyards tempering heat, streets swept clean by timed flows, bathhouses where cleanliness met community, and mosques where ablution was a choreography that remembered both body and river. The machine age did not begin with thunder. It began here with the hush of a wheel turning where it should, a pump drawing as designed, a clock marking time with a droplet's patience, and a manual that told the next pair of hands exactly what to do. From this culture of useful wonder, the future borrowed more than tricks. It borrowed an ethic. Make the device explain itself. Make the plan include its maintenance. Make the beauty serve. And measure outcomes not only in spectacle, but in bread, clean water, saved labor, and the unexciting goodness of things that work every single day. The earth was not a blur of distance. It was a face to be carefully read, measured, and mapped until journeys became promises instead of gambles. Geographers began with listening sailors speaking of currents that run like rivers inside the sea, camel drivers reciting waterholes in the order of thirst, farmers telling how the soil tastes of lime on one bank and of iron on another, and then they turned those testimonies into charts, itineraries, and atlases. Lines of latitude and longitude stitched the world into a grid so a traveler could say not only far and near, but here. Astronomers lent their instruments, and surveyors carried them inland to turn hills and courtyards into triangles whose sides and angles agreed on distances, elevating the art of the straight line into a conversation with curvature. On coasts, ports were drawn with soundings, wind roses, and approaches marked by bearings to headlands, so a captain could arrive by geometry instead of memory alone. On land, route books listed days between stations, grazing quality, and the temperament of tribes, because maps are never only about terrain, they are about people and the agreements that make movement safe. Scholars tried bold experiments to weigh the globe, climbing a mountain to measure the angle to the sea horizon, subtracting what the earth hides by its roundness, comparing that with distances walked below, then letting arithmetic return the circumference like a confession from the planet itself. Others checked by noting how a star's height changes with a day's journey north or south, accumulating small differences until the size of the world appeared not as boast, but as figure. River systems were traced as if they were genealogies, with tributaries named, slopes estimated, flood behaviors recorded, so villages could be sited on kindness, not on risk. Monsoon seasons were charted with months and directions. This is when the wind arrives from the ocean like a caravan of wet banners. This is when it turns and pulls ships home with equal favor, freeing commerce from superstition and tethering it to cycles a pilot can trust. Currents and upwellings were described by temperature and color, by the feel under an oar and the taste on the tongue, practical data that turned the sea into something a navigator could negotiate with. Inland, soils were more than dirt. They were characters with moods and talents. Agronomists wrote about clay that clings and sand that drains, about amendments that lighten heaviness or anchor looseness, about how to rotate crops so the ground does not grow bored and stingy. Irrigation texts showed how to level a field with a board and a waterline, how to set sluices so each furrow drinks fairly, how to avoid salt creeping upward with bad habits, how to make a small rise into a terrace that holds both soil and dignity. Orchards were planned as both food and climate machine, rows to coax breeze into corridors, pools to pack night air with coolness, walls to reflect winter sun into citrus. Botanists catalogued plants as if they were neighbors, leaves, flowers, seeds, uses, harms, preferred soils so a physician could find a remedy, a cook, a flavor, a dyer, a hue, and a farmer, a dependable friend for a difficult field. Some seeds learned new skies. Sugarcane crossed and sweetened markets, cotton-clothed cities and taxed mills. Rice found paddies where none existed before, and citrus taught winter to smell like summer. Each migration managed with notes on water needs, pests, and chill. Mineralogists and lapidaries took up the stories of stones, testing hardness, describing fracture, noting how ores announce themselves in the company they keep, teaching miners to follow signs instead of rumors, smelters to expect yields instead of surprises, and jewelers to honor materials with designs that suit their strengths. The best maps were humble. They kept blank spaces where knowledge was thin, wrote cautions where storms or bandits frequented, and updated themselves without vanity. When a traveler's letter corrected a coast, or a caravan's journal found a kerm, shorter pass. Libraries became way stations for geography. A sailor might leave a margin note about a reef. A merchant might add a price history for a port. A judge might append a boundary ruling, so a line on a page mirrored a line agreed upon by disputants on the ground. And always there was method. Measure with instruments when you can, check with witnesses when you cannot, and mark the uncertainty plainly so those who come after you can aim their certainty at the right spot. The ethics of mapping stood beside the tables of signs. Draw honestly where the poor will build. Name water that others will need to find in a hurry. Do not erase people with ink simply because power wishes them faint. Urban plans echoed the countryside's lessons, laying streets to catch wind, placing markets near water, setting gardens where runoff could be tamed and used, and reserving space for learning so that maps and minds could grow together. Even the arts were instructed by geography. Tilework borrowed river, meanders, and mountain tessellations. Poetry borrowed place names as anchors of memory. Travelogues braided devotion with data so the pilgrim and the scholar could share the same page. For judges dealing with the sacred direction, spherical geometry translated a round world into straight lines on prayer rugs. Draw this arc from your latitude and longitude, compute this angle, face here, and be at peace. For merchants, currency tables met distance tables, so profit rode along realistic itineraries. For physicians, climate notes met pharmacopoeias, so treatments respected the seasons of a city. For engineers, soil reports met load calculations, so foundations did not pretend. Students learned that the map is not the world, but it is a promise the world can keep if the mapmaker is honest and the traveler attentive. And when this knowledge crossed frontiers, it carried the aroma of olive presses and damp charts, the feel of a brass astrolabe warm from a hand, the pride of a farmer whose canal throws water exactly where the seeds wait, the relief of a captain who threads a foggy channel by bearing and depth alone, and the quiet smile of a judge who settles a boundary because the survey's triangles agree. In the end, the measure of our home was not bragged but cherished, a circumference calculated to honor the globe, a coastline drawn to protect mariners, a field leveled to protect harvests, a garden planned to protect hearts in summer's heat. This is how a civilization treats Earth, with curiosity that maps, with conscience that reports, with craft that cultivates, and with gratitude that turns knowledge into shade, into bread, into safe passage, and into the steady feeling that the world, though vast, is knowable enough to love well. A child could begin with the alphabet under a fig tree and end the day learning logic beside a jurist, because learning refused to stay indoors. Knowledge moved like a market breeze through courtyards, shops, and mosques, and wherever people gathered, a circle formed, and in that circle, a teacher lifted a thread that others would carry. The city was a campus whose gates were never closed. A weaver might pause at noon to hear a traveler recite lines from a new grammar. A spice merchant might finance a scholar's copy of a commentary, and a caravan master might arrive with a saddlebag, heavy with paper, and leave with it lightened by the generosity of a bookbinder who believed that pages are meant to roam. Waqf endowments paid not only for buildings but for essentials, oil for lamps, reeds for pens, stipends for poor students, and repairs for shelves, stressed by the weight of eager hands, so the river of learning would not slow at nightfall or drought. Women stood in these streams as teachers, patrons, transmitters, and writers, granting permissions to narrate, endowing fountains and schools, and anchoring entire chains of knowledge that later students, surprised by the tenderness in a footnote, would trace back to a grandmother of scholarship. A student's passport was the ijazah, not as a trophy but as a trust, naming the teacher and the line behind them, binding the present to the past so that truth could be traced like a family tree. Madrasas gave structure without cages, Quran with tajwid beside Arabic grammar, law beside ethics, logic beside rhetoric, arithmetic beside inheritance law, medicine beside metaphysics, astronomy beside calendrics, all woven so that specialization never meant isolation. Scribes perfected legibility in scripts tuned to the eye's comfort. Calligraphers turned precision into grace so that reading felt like ease rather than labor. And bookbinders stitched gatherings into volumes intended to survive generations of curious fingers. Catalogers imposed gentle order with titles, subjects, shelf marks, and borrowing notes that scolded only with courtesy because the goal was movement, not hoarding. Libraries were not hushed prisons of paper. They were workshops of ideas where students argued respectfully and returned in the evening to correct the margins of the day. Travel itself became curriculum. Young seekers left home with recommendation letters and returned with dialects, diagrams, and a broadened mercy, having learned that the same truth can wear different accents without becoming less true. They chased teachers across maps, comparing methods, collecting variants, and learning to weigh reliability the way a jeweler weighs gold, by touch and by test, never by rumor. Debate was not a sport of pride, but a furnace for clarity, where reason served revelation without trying to outrun it, and revelation welcomed reason without feeling threatened by its questions. Great handbooks arranged knowledge like a bazaar, where every stall knew its neighbors, principles at the entrance, cases and exceptions down the lane, cautions and rare curiosities at the far corner, and always a guidepost pointing back to intention: seek what benefits, avoid what harms, and keep the heart clean while the mind works hard. In this atmosphere, the scientific habit warmed its hands. Observation first, argument second. Write what you did before you write what you think it means. If a claim is beautiful but untested, place it gently on the shelf of perhaps until a measure or a repeatable demonstration invites it down. Grammar taught rigor to the tongue, law taught fairness to the weighing of evidence, arithmetic taught honesty to the ledger, and hadith science trained a generation to examine chains, compare versions, and mark the difference between strong and weak with humility, not insult. Even the architecture of learning carried lessons: courtyards with trees to rest the eye, fountains to soften the air, alcoves where a child could rehearse a line without shame, long rooms where voices layered but did not collide, and roofs that invited starlight, so an astronomy lesson could extend naturally from prayer time to planetary motion. The poor did not stand outside this story. Soup kitchens sat near libraries. Stipends kept talented students from having to choose between hunger and books. And traveling scholars could count on the generosity of strangers who knew that a night's lodging might be the last step needed to finish a commentary that would heal a confusion for people they would never meet. Princes might sponsor a chair, but the streets sponsored a culture, and that culture carried a conviction that to share a page is to lengthen a life. When mistakes happened, and in dense forests of text they always do errata, were not scandals but remedies, and the remedy became part of the lineage, so later readers could see not only the blossom, but the pruning that made it clean. Stories of scholars walking miles to verify a single line did not serve to intimidate the young. They served to invite them into a craft where diligence is love in action. In such a world, mastery was not loud. It was the quiet ability to locate a source, explain a method, and present a conclusion without bruising the truth or the listener. And when night settled on a city of learning, you could feel a soft covenant in the air. Teachers preparing tomorrow's questions, students rehearsing today's answers, and a society agreeing without meeting to vote that knowledge given with humility multiplies, while knowledge kept for status shrivels. Across seas and mountain passes, that covenant did not stay home. It traveled, translated, and took root in new soils until the world's classroom grew larger. Caravans of manuscripts crossed to ports where docks smelled of resin and hope, and in places like Sicily and Toledo, teams gathered under lamplight, one voice reading Arabic, another rendering into the streets Latin, a third shaping it into the polished Latin of schools, with a scribe chasing them all, catching each sentence before it cooled. From their hands came bridges of words that would carry algebra, astronomy, medicine, optics, and method into lecture halls that had been waiting for tools they did not yet know how to name. The very vocabulary betrayed the route of the caravan. Algebra walked in still wearing its name. Algorithm kept the echo of the scholar whose procedures civilized calculation. Alkali announced the laboratory's new manners. Zenith and nadir marked the sky with syllables that tasted of deserts and domes. Tables of signs entered with polite confidence and sat beside Euclid like a helpful cousin. Astrolabes moved from the belts of travelers to the benches of craftsmen who now learned to engrave star positions for latitudes far from the caliphal capitals. And medical encyclopedias arrived to rearrange curricula so that clinical observation would stand shoulder to shoulder with doctrine. Translators did more than swap words. They taught styles of thinking. First, define your terms. State your assumptions. Show your steps. Admit your error margin. Such phrases may sound ordinary, but they seeded habits that later centuries would call modern. Monasteries and new universities copied these texts until the sound of scraping pens became a kind of second tide, and teachers who had once leaned on a limited shelf found themselves with new instruments, new tables, and new methods that did not ask them to abandon faith, only to discipline curiosity. Ship captains took the star lists to sea and returned more often than chance would allow. Builders borrowed geometric tricks to dome spaces once left to timber. Physicians blended incoming pharmacopoeias with local plants and learned to keep case notes that respected both the patient and posterity. Debate erupted, as it always does when fresh air enters old rooms, and that was healthy. Some argued over the relationship of reason to revelation, others over the authority of newly translated masters who seemed to contradict beloved ancients. But beneath the tussles ran a shared discovery. Experiments speak a language older than disagreement. Test the lens. It will not flatter your position. Weigh the preparation. The balance is loyal to neither school. Observe the eclipse. The shadow cares nothing for your pride. In this way, a method traveled with the manuscripts, the refusal to treat authority as a finish line, the invitation to treat it as a starting block. Students in Paris and Oxford worked problems that merchants in Damascus had already turned into routine. Doctors in Salerno and Montpellier cited chapters whose authors walked Damascus wards and Nishapur streets. Clockmakers in the Rhine Valley adapted water clock logics to gears and escapements, and mapmakers borrowed grids and star heights to improve coasts, harbors, and pilgrim routes. No one civilization owned the sky or the pulse or the need for fair division. What traveled was a neighborly way of answering these universal questions with tools that built upon one another. And with every adoption came adaptation. Tables were recalculated for higher latitudes, instruments were resized for rougher seas, recipes were rewritten with local measures, and footnotes noted where snow and long twilight changed what a southern author assumed. This was not a one-way street. Ideas returned with new garments, entering courts and schools along different routes with improvements attached. And translators in the Islamic world read the returns with the same curiosity they had once extended. What did they find that we missed? What did they correct that we left vague? What did they build after reading our plans? Because pride that learns is stronger than pride that postures. The chain of transmission, then, looked less like a line and more like a braid. Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Sanskrit strands entered. Arabic wove them into patterns with new colors. Latin carried them onward, and from that fabric later artisans cut garments appropriate to their climates and ceremonies. Meanwhile, the street-level effects multiplied. Sailors found safer passages, farmers improved yields with more thoughtful irrigation, physicians reduced suffering with better dosages and clearer diagnostics. Builders raised spaces that gathered communities with sound and light, that obeyed calculation as much as inspiration, and judges ruled more fairly with geometry, advising where emotion might have misled. If you ask where the modern begins, the honest answer points to a meeting place, a circle of students and translators bent over a text, measuring words like gold dust, testing apparatus like skeptical friends, and refusing to let ignorance remain comfortable. What persisted across all borders was a set of virtues, dressed as procedures: gratitude before study, patience during confusion, generosity with sources, and humility before results that wound our pride but strengthen our grasp on reality. By the time printing presses multiplied pages, there was already a living memory of how to fill those pages well, and when new sciences rose with instruments of their own, they found a ready ally in a tradition that had long said, "Show me." So when we say that words like algebra, algorithm, alkali, and zenith are fossils of a journey, we honor more than etymology. We honor classrooms without walls, journals without vanity, and bridges of trust that carried methods across faiths and frontiers. That journey is not over. Every time a teacher writes clear steps so a stranger can repeat them, the bridge is extended. Every time a student corrects a table and returns the correction with courtesy, a new plank is added. Every time a craftsperson improves a recipe and sponsors a stipend for a learner they will never meet, the railing grows safer. And every time a heart begins study with Bismillah and ends with Alhamdulillah, intention forgives the stumbles along the way and turns labor into worship. This is the inheritance at our fingertips, not a museum of static marvels, but a living method that invites us to read, measure, weigh, test, translate, improve, and share so that knowledge continues its long migration from mind to mind, from shore to shore, and from prayer to practice, carrying light that no frontier can dim.